America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
Drugs in the U.S. have a long history, with the Italian mafia written all over it. Going back to the 20s, Jewish racketeers were the major figures, bringing in dope. Arnold Rothstein, for example, was a gigantic narcotics trafficker. As more and more Italians entered the dope game, cartels were becoming made up of a combination of Jews and Italians. A report found during the 1910s, the Brooklyn-based Camorra was dealing heavily in cocaine, and as early as 1917, Little Italy in East Harlem was as big a market as any in the U.S., and moving into the 30s, Italians became the dominant wholesalers in New York. Harlem, especially East Harlem, back then had a massive Italian population. So the predecessor to the DEA was the FBN, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and in their end-of-the-year report in 1942, they stated 44% of narcotics trafficking violators were Italian and 41% were Jewish. Going back to the mid to late 30s, prominent Italian gangsters are starting to get jammed up for narcotics violations. In 1938, one of the heroin chiefs of the Gambino family, Steve Armone, a captain at the time and brother to future Gambino underboss Joe Armone, is arrested for narcotics distribution. Back then, the majority of junk was being dealt out of East Harlem and Manhattan's Little Italy. Two of Lucky Luciano's co-defendants during his 1936 prostitution case were major drug traffickers. Thomas the Bull Pinocchio, an extremely notorious drug trafficker running his operation on Mott Street, and Ralph Ligori, a very dangerous man who handles large narcotic operations for Lucky Luciano. And in 1941, the powerful up-and-comer Tony Ducks Corallo was finally jammed up on a state drug case. Now, the late 30s run right into the start of World War II, and it's at this time that international drug distribution comes to a halt throughout Europe. Opium sources in Southeast and Southwest Asia get cut off, so the mob starts looking south into Mexico and South America for new drug suppliers. So, with the shortages and having to look towards Mexico, it's at this time the U.S. is introduced to black tar heroin, and this black tar was said to be 50% pure, while the powder previously coming in from Europe was said to be around 95% pure. So, not only is there a heroin shortage at the start of World War II, but the heroin coming in from Mexico has half the purity, and the mob just doesn't care. They increase the price, blame the war, and it's business as usual, while the addicts suffer the price increase and the purity decrease. Now, it's guys like Tom Mix Santoro, who along with Dominic "The Gap" Petrelli and Frank Lavorsi, who drove all the way down to Texas to have a sit-down with Harold Meltzer, an international drug trafficker who was smuggling large-scale narcotics from Mexico and Cuba to places like California for guys like Louis Dragna, the brother of LA crime family boss Jack Dragna, and to New York to guys like Big John Ormento. Harold Meltzer had been smuggling drugs in from Mexico and South America for years. So when you can't deal through Asia and Europe, and you gotta look south for new connections, Harold Meltzer is your man. So after Tom Mix, Dominic Petrelli, and Frank Lavorsi secure this new connect, they continue to drive all along the Texas, Arizona, and California borders to secure as many Mexican drug connections as they can. And to oversee these operations, Tom Mix and Petrelli regularly made trips to Mexico together in their Buick Coupe, and they once even flew Eastern Airlines into Mexico City together. So Tom Mix, Lavorsi, and Petrelli are extremely busy drug traffickers during the start of World War II using their new Mexican connections. And the Mexicans are smuggling in this opium gum into the U.S. through California and Arizona, and it's being driven all the way cross country to New York and being processed into heroin in underground labs throughout New York City. Even Lepke Buchalter has his own morphine processing lab in the Bronx. So after it's processed into heroin, they are wholesaling it to dealers across the U.S. and charging $600 an ounce. Now, I can tell you that back when I was doing heroin in 2012, an ounce from a Mexican plug was $600, and that was a good price. But I guess when you're John Ormento and Dominic Santoro and you have a monopoly on heroin during World War II, when there's a national shortage, you can charge whatever you feel like. But the golden age of heroin comes after the end of World War II, from 1946 to 1957. So when the ports opened back up across the world, drugs flooded into the U.S. Drug use spiked up 30% from 1947 to 1950. Now, this is the dope that's coming in from Turkey and Lebanon and being refined in Corsican labs and smuggled into the U.S. And this is when you got guys like Joe Beck di Palermo and his million brothers slanging dope in Manhattan's Little Italy, guys like Carmine Galante and Tony Mira of the Bananos, Vito Genovese and Vincent Gigante of the Genovese. You got the big dogs in Detroit moving mad weight, guys like Joe Catalanato, Frankie Coppola, Pete Licavoli, Angelo Mele, Detroit heavyweight Papa John Preziola, an extremely powerful drug trafficker, along with the Quazaranos. You also have Pete Casella and Tony Caponigro out of Newark and Philly. You got Joseph Matranga and Louis Dragna out of California. And another major hub of heroin distribution is coming out of East Harlem with guys like Big John Ormento, Dominic Santoro, Michael Nicoline, Anthony Napolitano, Vincent Squilante, and Joe and Vincent Rao. Now, moving weight in the dope game takes a lot of people. Usually there is a financier or multiple financiers, and you gotta have the plug. You need couriers for drugs and for money. You need refining labs and safe houses where you can step on it and store it. And now you're at the retail level. You need mid-level buyers and sellers to move pounds, half pounds, and ounces. Then pounds are getting broken down into ounces and grams, and this is where the street level dealers come in. Moving weight is a huge operation. The Italians basically have a monopoly because they have the plug. The plugs are the 6 Corsican crime families. Corsica is a large island between France and Italy with a long history of banditry. They even speak a dialect of Sicilian. So the Corsicans' base is in Marseille, and they have been working with the Italians for decades and have built up a strong mutual trust. So after World War II ended, the Italians in New York and Detroit revived their connections with the Corsicans. So it's all starting in the opium fields of Turkey and Lebanon and moving to Italy and Marseille to be refined in underground labs and then being shipped across the Atlantic to Montreal, Detroit, and New York. Now, the 107th Street crew is extremely notorious, and guys like Big John and Tom Mix are kicking up to family boss Tommy Lucchese. Now, Tom Mix and Big John, they came up together. They go way back when it comes to drug dealing and the 107th Street crew. So when you look at this nice looking grandpa of a man right here, you can assure yourself this guy was deep in the drug game in his youth and was one bad, powerful man in the Lucchese crime family during his rise to underboss. Big John had come a long way from his humble beginnings. He was born on August 1st, 1912, and at an early age started hanging around East Harlem, and guys respected and feared Big John. He became extremely powerful. He was a capo, and still at capo, he attended the Appalachian meeting in 1957. He was responsible for a large part of the narcotic smuggling and distribution in the U.S. He gets jammed up for the first time in 1937 for federal narcotic law violations. This guy was moving weight. He knew all the key players in New York, and he was close with the top dealers in Detroit who were extremely powerful. When he was on the street, he was making moves. He loved finely tailored suits, and he loved to stop by the Copacabana where waiters and staff treated him like a king. So, by 40 years old, he had had 3 separate convictions under the Harrison Act for narcotics violations. And remember, he was one of only a few capos that attended the Appalachian meeting, because on the itinerary for that night was discussing drug dealing, and you can best believe he was going to go all Don Zalucci from The Godfather at that meeting.
I want to control it as a business, to keep it respectable. I don't want it near schools. I don't want it sold to children. That's an infamia.
So, to stay clear of government bugs, Big John would hop into his beloved black 57 Chevy convertible and pull up to the Copacabana. It's there he would simply pick a table and pay the wait captain in the seating area to keep all nearby tables unoccupied. It reminds me of that scene from Goodfellas when Henry takes Karen to the Copa and they immediately get seated. I couldn't even imagine being a legitimate guy back in the 50s, 60s, or 70s and going to work all week and probably having to save up a little to one day do something nice with the wife, and you go to the Copa, you wait in line forever, and right as you're about to get seated, some high roller walks up and all their attention goes to him, and instantly you've become forgotten for however much longer till another table opens up. And that's because being rich and throwing around a lot of money opens doors for people, and definitely being connected in a place like New York back then was opening all kinds of doors. And these guys, these connected guys, were going out and getting first-class service and treatment wherever they went, especially the top dogs like the bosses and the capos. So Tom Mix and Dominic Petrelli were extremely close. Petrelli had very intimate knowledge of the drug trafficking operation going on in East Harlem. So Dominic Petrelli was an early friend of Joe Valachi, and in 1931 was a personal bodyguard of Salvatore Maranzano. He was an original member of the Lucchese crime family. He would go on to be known as Mr. Big in Harlem, but later on down the road, after serving 5 years on a narcotics conviction, would inform on fellow drug-dealing associates right before being deported to his native Italy. So he sneaks back into the country, and about 3 weeks after sneaking back in 1953, at 3:50 a.m., he enters a bar at 634 East 183rd Street at Hughes Avenue, considered to be the heart of Little Italy in the Bronx. And right after he enters 3 men wearing glasses, all with one hand in their coat pockets. Petrelli sees the men and tries to run away through the kitchen, but they follow him in and shoot him 8 times in the back, neck, and head, and end the life of Dominic the Gap Petrelli. And one of the people believed to be informed on by Petrelli was Big John Ormento. So the feds built a case, and narcotics agents had been seizing about 200 pounds of heroin every year. And an informant believed to be Petrelli told the feds the Corsican crime families were smuggling in 200 pounds every other week. And at this time, the 2 biggest heroin dealers in New York were Carmine Galante and Big John Ormento. The feds are dying to break up this massive drug conspiracy, and in February of 1959, federal and city narcotics agents carry out a series of raids, and what they find at the time was the second largest amount of heroin ever seized in the U.S. And one man to get arrested during these raids is William Billy Bats Bentivna. Yes, the man Frank Vincent brilliantly portrayed in the gangster classic Goodfellas.
Relax, will you, for crying out? What's getting to you? I'm breaking your balls a little bit, that's all. I'm only kidding with you.
Alongside Billy Bat's arrest were Giuseppe Catroni and Luigi Greco of Montreal, Carmine Galante, John Ormento, Sal Giglio, Angelo Tuminaro, Carlo DiPietro, Rocco Sanchinella, Angelo Loecano, Frank Mari, the Panico brothers, Salvatore and Carmine, Little Davy Patillo, Lucky Luciano's co-defendant in 1936, and William Struzzieri and Tony Mira. The first trial was overseen by Judge Levitt and went on for about 6 months, but was frequently being disrupted by delays, fake illnesses, mysterious accidents, and other misfortunes, so much so that Judge Levitt had to remand all the defendants to ensure their continued presence. For example, little Davy Patillo suffered from a quote-unquote fake heart attack. Rocco Sanchinella's lawyer suddenly started to suffer from an incapacitating illness. A brother of one of the jurors died. Defendants continuously missed court, and because of all of this, the trial was adjourned to January 3rd, 1961. All this disorder and delay ended in a mistrial when the jury foreman broke his back falling down a flight of stairs in an abandoned building. It looks like the mafia was pulling out all its greatest hits during this trial. During jury selection, Salvatore Panico jumped up and ran into the jury box and started pushing and shouting at one of the potential jurors, screaming in front of the judge and everyone, "Get me out of here, Big John, Joe B., they are the junk pushers," among other things. And the problems were just beginning. When Salvatore Panico was put on the stand, the following occurred. Question: do you know a person named Anthony Mira? Panico: yes, I do. Question: do you see him in the courtroom? Panico: there he is over there, the third from the right. Question: he happens to be the fifth from the right, but I will take it. Let the record reflect he identified Mira after he stood up. Defendant Mira: let the record reflect he can't see over here. It was outbursts like this that frequently got Mira and other defendants removed from the courtroom. The next day, Panico was put on the stand again. Salvatore Panico: DiPietro is talking about me there. He is the convicted dope pusher. Separate me from him. Defendant DiPietro: stop him. I told you, Al. Mr. Krieger: I move for a mistrial as far as DiPietro is concerned. DiPietro responded: every one of my witnesses he made a holler. Mr. Tendi: may the jury be excused. The judge: the jury is excused. I will say as you go out, you must ignore these outbursts. Defendant DiPietro: I never made a sound all this time. If he comes into this courtroom when I am here, I will strangle him. He interrupted my 7 witnesses. Chain him down if you got to. Mr. Krieger: my client wishes to address the court himself. May he do it here and now? The judge: no, he may not. You speak for him. You have been speaking very well. DiPietro: yes, I will strangle him myself. I will get him out of the courtroom. On May 31st, 1962, the trial was resumed and Salvatore again disrupted the proceedings with an outburst directed this time at defendant Galante. He was again removed from the courtroom. The court ordered that he be gagged and shackled to restrain him from any further outbursts or other disruptive conduct in the courtroom. During the remainder of the trial, he remained gagged and shackled, and there were no further incidents in the presence of the jury. Hardly a minute passed without a chorus of objections, motions for mistrial, severance, etc. Defendants resorted to every conceivable means to interrupt, delay, and abort the trial, to inject or provoke reversible error, or to plant the seeds for post-conviction relief. Some defense counsel were repeatedly and inexcusably tardy. Defendants and certain defense counsel claimed numerous incapacitating illnesses and injuries which physical examinations failed to substantiate. Verbal outbursts and obscenities were commonplace. On one occasion, John Ormento overpowered 4 marshals, forced his way from the courtroom, and tried to break into the robing room, screaming obscenities at the judge. Anthony Mira, who claimed insanity, shouted, "They are all dope pushers." When asked on the stand if he knew certain co-defendants the next morning while under cross-examination, Mira picked up the witness chair and hurled it at the assistant United States attorney. The chair missed the assistant but struck and shattered against the jury rail. Seized by the marshals, Mira said, "All right, I won't fight. All right, I won't fight." When Mira was brought back into the courtroom, the court ordered him put back in his chair, shackled, and gagged. Mira asked, "What are you going to gag me for?" When brought up for sentencing June 26, 1962 on contempt charges for the chair incident and other incidents during the trial, on being asked by the court whether he had anything to say in his own behalf, Mira answered, "Nothing much, Your Honor, except that I am a hothead, period." And later, "Well, I am sorry for the chair incident, Your Honor. The other things I didn't realize were contemptible. I was just shooting off my mouth. I didn't realize that was contempt." On one occasion, Mira and Salvatore Panico claimed they had been drugged and were unable to remember what had transpired in the courtroom. Finally, in June 1962, members of the ring were found guilty, with John Ormento sentenced to 40 years, Carmine Galante sentenced to 20 years, Carlo Di Pietro 12 years, Salvatore Panico 20 years, his brother Carmine Panico 12 years, and Billy Batts 15 years, and Tony Mira 20 years. After hearing his sentencing, John Ormento just shook his head and went to jail, where he died in 1974.